Welcome to Eva's Whisper. Sometimes, the most expensive things we buy are the lies we tell ourselves, and the heaviest burdens are the ones we carry in secret. Listen closely, because today's story might just hit a little too close to home. The morning sun filtered through the horizontal blinds of Barbara's living room, casting neat, predictable lines across the beige carpet. At 68 years old, Barbara found a deep, profound comfort in predictability. She sat at her small oak dining table, a mug of store-bought drip coffee warming her hands, and scrolled through the digital grocery coupons on her iPad. For a retired high school guidance counselor living in a modest 55-plus community in central Ohio, this was the definition of peace. Barbara didn't need much. After 35 years of navigating the turbulent emotional waters of teenagers in the public school system, she craved quiet. Her community, Whispering Pines, offered exactly that. The lawns were maintained by the association, her neighbors went to bed by 9, and the most dramatic event of the month was usually a dispute over the bingo caller's pacing. Out in the driveway sat her pride and joy, a 2015 Honda CR-V. It had 80,000 miles on it, a few minor scratches near the trunk from loading gardening supplies, and most importantly, it was completely paid off. Financially, Barbara was practically a fortress. She wasn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but she was incredibly secure. She knew exactly down to the penny what her monthly Social Security check would be. She managed her individual retirement account with the cautious precision of a bomb disposal expert, ensuring her withdrawals were perfectly calibrated so she would never outlive her money. Living on a fixed income wasn't a punishment for Barbara. It was a puzzle she had successfully solved. She slept soundly every single night, knowing she owed nothing to anyone. If only she could say the same for her son. Mark was 35, handsome, hard-working, and according to every outward metric, living the absolute American dream. But whenever Barbara thought about Mark, a tight knot of anxiety formed right in the center of her chest. Mark and his wife, Jessica, didn't just live in a different neighborhood. They lived in an entirely different reality. Jessica, at 32, was a force of nature fueled entirely by appearances. They lived in a sprawling, brand-new McMansion in a high-end, gated suburb nearly an hour away. The house had 6 bedrooms for 3 people, a 4-car garage, and a 2-story foyer that echoed like a shopping mall. Every time Barbara visited, she felt like she was walking into a museum rather than a home. Everything was perfectly curated, heavily stylized, and incredibly fragile. To Jessica, life was a performance, and the audience was everyone on the internet. She was deeply invested in a lifestyle that Barbara frankly found exhausting. There were country club memberships they hardly ever used, weekend trips to boutique spas, and a constant, never-ending parade of cardboard delivery boxes piling up on their massive front porch. Jessica's social media feeds were a highlight reel of name-brand clothes, leased luxury SUVs, and perfectly plated dinners at restaurants, where a single steak cost more than Barbara's weekly grocery budget. Barbara loved her son. She really did. She remembered Mark as a practical, grounded boy who used to save his allowance for months just to buy a new baseball glove. But the man she saw now was a stranger. He looked perpetually exhausted. His shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of maintaining the gilded cage his wife had constructed. When he smiled in their family photos, it never quite reached his eyes. The underlying tension between Barbara and Jessica was a quiet, humming current that colored every interaction. Barbara tried her best to be a supportive mother-in-law. She bit her tongue more often than not, but the alienation she felt was absolute. Just last month, Barbara had driven her trusty Honda up to their neighborhood for a Sunday afternoon visit. She remembered pulling into their driveway, parking her practical, slightly dusty car next to Jessica's pristine, $80,000 Range Rover. The contrast was almost comical. When Barbara walked through the oversized mahogany front doors, Jessica had greeted her with that tight, practiced smile she reserved for people she deemed socially unhelpful. "Barb," Jessica had cooed, air kissing near Barbara's cheek. "You made it. And you drove that little car all the way out here on the highway? You are so brave. Mark and I keep saying we really need to get you into a safer lease. Something European, maybe. The safety features these days are just a must." Barbara had just smiled politely, gripping the handle of her sensible canvas purse. "My Honda runs just fine, Jessica. It gets me from point A to point B, and the best safety feature is that I hold the title to it." Jessica had let out a high, breathy laugh that lacked any real warmth. "Oh, you are just too funny. Honey, come on in. I want to show you the new custom drapery we had imported for the formal dining room." As Barbara had followed her daughter-in-law through the cavernous house, her internal monologue had been running a mile a minute. She looked at the imported drapes, the massive crystal chandelier, the marble countertops that required special, expensive cleaners, and all she saw was debt. It felt chaotic. It felt loud. Barbara knew the realities of math. She knew what a mid-level regional manager at a logistics firm like Mark made, and she knew it couldn't possibly cover the sheer volume of cash flowing out of that house every single day. The country club dues alone were probably a third of her monthly pension. During that visit, they had sat on the brand-new, oversized patio furniture that Jessica proudly announced had cost as much as a used car. Mark had sat quietly, sipping a craft beer, constantly checking his phone, while Jessica held court. "We are just so blessed," Jessica had said, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "We are thinking about putting in a saltwater pool next spring. The community pool is just getting a little too crowded with all the new developments going up down the road. You know how it is." "A pool is a huge expense, Jessica," Barbara had offered gently, unable to completely stop the guidance counselor in her from speaking up. "The maintenance alone is something to really consider." Jessica had waved her hand dismissively, her diamond rings catching the afternoon sun. "Oh, we aren't worried about that. Mark is up for a promotion eventually, and you have to spend money to make money, right? It's all about networking. You wouldn't understand, Barb. It's just a different world now than when you were working at the school." The condescension had hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Barbara had looked over at Mark, hoping he would jump in, maybe defend her a little, or at least bring his wife back down to planet Earth. But Mark just kept his eyes glued to his phone screen, his jaw clenched tight. That was the hardest part for Barbara. It wasn't the snide remarks about her clothes or her car. It was watching her son shrink into a shadow of himself just to keep up a facade. She had spent decades counseling high school seniors, helping them plan for real, sustainable futures. She had taught thousands of kids the value of living within their means, of building a foundation before trying to build a castle. And yet, here was her own son, living in a house of cards that looked like a fortress. Sitting at her small oak table now, finishing the last cold sip of her Folgers coffee, Barbara closed the coupon app on her iPad. She looked around her quiet, comfortable living room. The furniture was a decade old, the television wasn't a flat-screen cinema, and she didn't have custom imported drapes. But she had something far more valuable than anything inside Jessica's sprawling McMansion. She had freedom. She had the absolute certainty that when she went to sleep tonight, no bank was going to call, and no creditor was going to knock on her door. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. She knew a storm was coming for Mark. You couldn't live on the edge of a cliff forever without eventually looking down and realizing there was no solid ground beneath you. She just prayed that when the fall inevitably happened, Mark would survive the landing. She was prepared to be his soft place to land, just like a mother should be. What she didn't know sitting there in the peaceful morning light, was just how much of her own foundation he was going to tear up on his way down, and how soon that frantic, desperate knock on her door was actually going to come. The flashback to 6 months ago played in Barbara's mind like a movie she could not stop watching. It was a bleak Tuesday evening in late February, the kind of Ohio winter night where the sleet stings your face and the cold dampness seems to seep right through the walls and into your bones. Barbara was wrapped in her favorite fleece cardigan, watching a game show on the television with the volume turned down low when the doorbell chimed. The sound was startling. Nobody in Whispering Pines visited past 7 o'clock in the evening unless it was an absolute medical emergency. She padded over to the front door and peered through the brass peephole. Standing on her front porch, shivering in a thin nylon windbreaker and looking like a ghost of himself, was Mark. She swung the door open, her heart doing a frightened, erratic flutter in her chest. "Mark! Honey, what are you doing here? It is freezing out there." He stepped inside, bringing the sharp smell of damp wool and cold air with him. He didn't say a single word at first. He just stood in her narrow entryway, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. And then her strong, 35-year-old son, the successful regional manager with the enormous house and the picture-perfect life, just crumbled. He dropped his face into his hands and started weeping. Not a quiet, polite cry, but deep, heavy heaves that seemed to tear right out of his chest. "Mark, dear God, what happened? Is it Jessica? Are the kids okay?" Barbara asked frantically, ushering him toward the living room couch, her mind instantly racing to the darkest possible places. "I am losing it, Mom," he choked out, collapsing onto the floral sofa cushions. "I am losing everything." Barbara rushed into the kitchen and made a pot of Folgers coffee. It was what she always did in a crisis. The simple action of measuring grounds and pouring water grounded her. 10 minutes later, they were sitting at the small oak dining table. Mark had both hands wrapped tightly around a steaming ceramic mug, staring down into the dark liquid like it held the answers to the universe. "All right," Barbara said softly, taking a seat directly across from him. "Talk to me. Tell me exactly what is going on." Mark took a deep, shaky breath, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "We are drowning, Mom. We are completely, entirely, financially underwater." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating in the quiet condo. Barbara felt a cold knot form in the pit of her stomach, but she kept her face perfectly composed. "Okay, walk me through it. How bad is it?" "It is a total disaster," he admitted, his voice cracking on the last syllable. He looked up at her, and the sheer, unfiltered exhaustion in his eyes broke her heart. "You know that massive house we bought? We stretched our budget to the absolute breaking point to get it. Jessica fell in love with the neighborhood, and the builder promised us this great introductory rate on an adjustable rate mortgage. I thought I would get that vice president promotion by the time the rate locked in at the higher tier. I thought we would have plenty of breathing room." He ran a trembling hand nervously through his damp hair. "I did not get the promotion. And 2 months ago, the introductory period on the mortgage expired. The interest rate adjusted. Mom, our monthly payment shot up by over $1,000 a month. We were barely scraping by before, playing this insane shell game with credit cards just to pay the utility bills and keep up appearances. Now, we are entirely maxed out. Every single card is completely at the limit." Barbara felt a sudden wave of nausea. She had spent 35 years counseling high school students to read the fine print, to avoid financial traps just like this. To hear her own son fall into the classic American debt trap was agonizing. "Mark," she said gently, trying her absolute hardest to keep any trace of judgment out of her voice. "What about Jessica? Have you guys sat down and looked at the budget together?" You need to sell the cars, downsize immediately, maybe even put the house on the market. Mark let out a hollow, bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. Jessica has no idea. She does not know a single thing. Barbara stared at him, stunned into silence for a moment. What do you mean she does not know? How can she not know? Because I handle all the finances, he confessed, shame washing over his face and coloring his cheeks red. And because I have been terrified to tell her. You know how she is, Mom. You know what that house means to her. Her whole identity is wrapped up in that neighborhood, the country club, the image we project to her friends. If I tell her we are broke, if I tell her I failed to provide the life I promised her. His voice trailed off, and a tear slipped down his cheek. She will leave me. I know she will. She will pack her bags and walk out, and I will lose my marriage on top of losing the house. Oh, honey, Barbara whispered, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. I am 3 months behind on the mortgage, Mark blurted out, the emotional dam finally breaking. The bank has been sending pre-foreclosure notices in the mail. I intercept the mail every single day before Jessica gets home so she does not see the envelopes. I am terrified she is going to answer the front door one morning and find a sheriff serving us eviction papers. Mom, I am so scared. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I feel like I am having a heart attack every single day of my life. He gripped her hand tightly, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. I need a loan. Please, just $50,000 to catch up on the arrears and give me a cushion for a few months to figure things out. I will pay you back. I swear to God, I will pay you back every single dime with interest. Just help me fix this. Barbara sat back in her chair, the silence in the kitchen stretching out for a long, agonizing minute. She was a retired woman, living on a fixed income. Her pension and Social Security covered her monthly living expenses, with a little bit left over for groceries and gas. The bulk of her life savings, her safety net, was locked away securely in her traditional individual retirement account. She had meticulously planned for her twilight years, running the numbers over and over, ensuring she would never be a financial burden to anyone, especially Mark. She did the math in her head. $50,000. It was a massive chunk of her nest egg. But worse than that, she knew a lump sum loan would not fix the root of the problem. If she just handed him a check, the money would disappear into the black hole of their lifestyle debt, and in 6 months, they would be right back in this exact same desperate situation. The adjustable rate mortgage was not going to magically lower itself. The expensive country club dues were still going to hit the credit card every month. Jessica's spending habits were not going to change because she did not even know there was a crisis to worry about. Mark, Barbara finally said, her voice steady and resolute, I am not going to give you a $50,000 loan. The hope drained out of Mark's face instantly. He pulled his hand away and slumped back in his chair, looking utterly defeated. I understand. It was entirely too much to ask. I am sorry, Mom. Forget I asked. Stop talking and listen to me, Barbara commanded softly, leaning forward across the table. I am not giving you a lump sum because it will not solve the problem. It is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. But I am not going to let you lose your home. And I am not going to let your marriage fall apart over money. Mark looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then what are you saying? Barbara took a deep breath, mentally saying goodbye to the absolute financial security she had spent 4 decades building. I am going to take over the mortgage payments. Directly. The $4,200 a month. I will set up an auto draft from my trust account directly to your lender starting tomorrow. We will get the arrears caught up immediately, and I will cover the monthly bill until you can figure out a permanent solution. Maybe you get that promotion. Maybe you find a new job. But you need breathing room, and I am going to give it to you." Mark stared at her, his mouth slightly open in shock. "Mom? No. That is over $4,000 a month. You are retired. You cannot afford that. It will destroy your savings. I have enough to keep the roof over your head for a while." Barbara lied smoothly. It would not bankrupt her immediately, but the long-term damage would be severe. Pulling that much money out of her traditional retirement account every month meant she was going to get hammered by income taxes. The government would view those withdrawals as taxable income, pushing her into a higher tax bracket and draining her resources far faster than the actual mortgage payment itself. She was essentially setting her own financial house on fire to keep her son warm. "Mom, I cannot let you do that," Mark protested, though his voice lacked any real conviction. He was drowning, and she was throwing him a life raft. He was far too exhausted to swim away from it. "You do not have a choice," Barbara said firmly. "But there is one absolute condition. This stays strictly between you and me. Jessica cannot know." Mark blinked rapidly. "You want me to keep lying to her?" "No," Barbara corrected him, her tone serious. "I want you to protect your marriage right now while things are fragile. If she finds out you were hiding foreclosure notices, and that your retired mother has to pay for the roof over her head, the humiliation and the betrayal will destroy your relationship. You need time to fix your income, to slowly introduce the idea of downsizing, and to get yourselves on solid ground. Until then, my involvement is an absolute secret. Do you understand me?" Tears welled up in Mark's eyes all over again. He stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped his arms tightly around his mother. "Thank you. Mom, thank you so much. I promise I will make this right. I promise." Barbara hugged him back, resting her chin on his shoulder. She rubbed his back, murmuring soothing words, playing the role of the comforting mother perfectly. But inside, a cold, heavy dread was settling deep into her bones. After Mark left that night, the condo felt entirely too quiet. Barbara walked into her small bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress. She pulled out her iPad and opened her banking application. She looked at the balances she had worked so incredibly hard to build. The numbers that represented her planned Alaskan cruise, her future medical care, her absolute independence. Tomorrow, she would call her financial advisor and authorize the monthly transfers. She would swallow the intense anxiety. She would take the massive tax hit on her withdrawals. She would sacrifice her own peace of mind to keep the illusion of her son's perfect life intact. She turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. For the first time in years, Barbara lay awake, listening to the winter wind rattle the window panes, feeling completely and utterly insecure about her future. The ship was sinking, and she had just chained herself directly to the anchor. The harsh, buzzing ring of the third period bell echoed through the cinder-block hallways of Westside High School, making Barbara flinch. At 68 years old, she had promised herself she would never again have to deal with the overwhelming smell of floor wax, cheap body spray, and adolescent apathy. Yet, here she was on a rainy Tuesday in October, standing in front of a classroom of 30 teenagers who were entirely ignoring her. She wiped down the whiteboard with a dry eraser, her shoulder aching with the repetitive motion. 6 months. It had been exactly 6 months since Mark had sat at her kitchen table and cried into his coffee cup. 6 months of secretly draining her life savings to keep the bank from taking his house. To offset the massive financial bleed, Barbara had swallowed her pride, called the school district, and put her name back on the active substitute teaching roster. It was not just the $4,200 a month she was sending directly to Mark's mortgage lender. That was bad enough. But as someone who had carefully planned her retirement in the United States, Barbara knew the brutal reality of taxes. Pulling an extra $50,000 a year out of her traditional retirement accounts meant she was suddenly pushed into a much higher tax bracket. The government was taking a massive bite out of every withdrawal. Worse, the extra income on paper was threatening to increase her Medicare premiums for the following year. She was bleeding money from every possible direction, and the only way to slow the bleeding was to stand on her aching feet for 8 hours a day, earning $130 a shift, trying to get high school sophomores to read American history. When the lunch bell finally rang, Barbara sank into the stiff plastic chair behind the teacher's desk. She pulled a squished turkey on whole wheat sandwich from her tote bag, alongside a bruised apple. It was a far cry from the lunches she used to enjoy. Just a year ago, she and her 3 best friends from Whispering Pines had sat around her condo, drinking iced tea and planning the trip of a lifetime. A 10-day Alaskan cruise. They had booked the tickets, picked out their excursions, and talked about the glaciers and the whale watching every single time they saw each other. 2 months after taking over Mark's mortgage, Barbara had to make the most humiliating phone call of her life. She remembered sitting on her bed, staring at the glossy cruise brochure, before calling her friend Martha. She had lied through her teeth. She told Martha that her Honda needed a new transmission, and that the heating and cooling unit at the condo was on its last legs. She claimed she just could not justify the expense of the trip right now. Martha had been incredibly sweet and understanding, offering to help her pay for it, which only made Barbara feel 10 times worse. She had declined, of course. Last week, Martha and the girls had sailed out of Seattle without her. Barbara had spent that entire week turning off her phone so she would not have to look at the photos they were texting her. She had sacrificed her one big dream so her daughter-in-law could keep living in a fantasy world. And Jessica was certainly living it up. Barbara took a bite of her dry turkey sandwich and, against her better judgment, opened the social media app on her phone. She told herself she just wanted to check on her grandson, but she knew what she was really doing. She was picking at a scab. Right at the top of her feed was a brand new post from Jessica. There was a photo of Jessica standing in the driveway of the McMansion, wearing designer sunglasses and holding a massive bouquet of roses. Behind her, sitting proudly on the paved concrete, was a brand new, pristine white Lexus SUV. It had one of those giant red bows on the hood, the kind you only see in obnoxious holiday television commercials. The caption underneath read, "Hubby completely surprised me for our anniversary. So incredibly blessed to have a man who treats me like a queen. Upgrading the mom car in style. #blessed. #dream life." Barbara stared at the screen, her vision actually blurring with sudden hot anger. She felt a physical sickness in the pit of her stomach. Mark was paying for a luxury car lease on credit, while his mother was eating a smashed sandwich in a damp high school classroom to keep a roof over his head. She scrolled down, her thumb trembling slightly. Just 3 days prior, there was another post. This one was a selfie of Jessica and 2 of her neighborhood friends, wearing plush white robes and holding flutes of champagne. The location tag said they were at a high-end luxury spa downtown. "Self-care Sunday with my girls," Jessica had written. "Sometimes you just have to unplug and pamper yourself." Barbara dropped her phone onto the desk like it was actively burning her hand. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it all was suffocating. She was risking her entire future for this. If she had a stroke tomorrow, or if her knees finally gave out and she needed an assisted living facility, the money she had painstakingly saved for her own care was vanishing into Jessica's spa treatments and car leases. She was trading her own dignity and independence for Jessica's social media likes. The resentment did not just simmer, it boiled. And it was not just directed at her oblivious daughter-in-law. It was directed squarely at Mark. When Barbara had first agreed to this arrangement, Mark had promised they would figure it out. He had sworn this was a temporary bridge. But as the months dragged on, the bridge felt more like a permanent highway, and Mark was nowhere to be found. Before the financial collapse, Mark used to call her every single Sunday afternoon. They would chat for a half hour about his week, the yard work he was doing, or the books Barbara was reading. It was a reliable, comforting routine. Now Mark was a ghost. The phone calls had stopped completely. When Barbara tried to call him, it always went straight to his voicemail. A few hours later, she would get a short, sterile text message. "Sorry, Mom. Tied up with work. Hope you are having a good weekend. Love you." She knew exactly why he was avoiding her. The guilt was eating him alive. Every time he heard her voice, he was reminded of what a massive failure he was. He could not look her in the eye because he knew he was a coward. He was too terrified to stand up to his wife, too weak to say no to the car leases and the spa days, and too ashamed to admit to his mother that he had completely lost control of his own household. So instead of facing the problem, he just hid from it. He hid from Jessica by pretending the money was still flowing, and he hid from Barbara because she was the only one who knew the ugly, pathetic truth. Barbara packed up the remains of her lunch and threw the trash into the bin by the door. She looked out the classroom window at the gray, overcast Ohio sky. She felt so incredibly tired. Not just physically, though her back and legs were screaming for rest. She was tired in her soul. She had spent her entire adult life doing the right thing. She had worked hard, saved diligently, paid her taxes, and never asked anyone for a handout. She had built a fortress of security for her old age, so she would never be a burden to society or her family. And now, she was watching that fortress be dismantled brick by brick. Not by a medical emergency or a natural disaster, but by the reckless vanity of a woman she could not stand and the paralyzing cowardice of a son she loved. The bell rang for fourth period, loud and jarring. The teenagers began pouring back into the classroom, loud, chaotic, and completely oblivious to the older woman standing at the front of the room. Barbara picked up her dry erase marker. She took a deep, shaky breath, pushing the anger down into a tight little box in her chest. She had to get through this afternoon. She had to earn her $130. Because on the first of the month, the bank was going to deduct $4,200 from her account, and Jessica's new Lexus was not going to pay for itself. But as she turned to write the day's lesson on the board, a quiet, dangerous thought finally crystallized in her mind. She could not do this forever. The well was going to run dry, and when it did, she was not going to let herself be the one who died of thirst. The secret was toxic, and it was slowly killing her. Something had to break, and Barbara decided right then and there, it was not going to be her. The Ohio heat was absolutely oppressive that Thursday afternoon. The air conditioning in Barbara's small condo was humming loudly, fighting a losing battle against the humid July air pressing against the window panes. Barbara sat at her dining room table, a stack of bills and a calculator spread out before her. She was doing what she had done on the 15th of every month for the last 40 years. She was balancing her budget. But lately, this simple routine task felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. She carefully wrote down the numbers in her paper ledger. Every single time she subtracted the $4,200 for Mark's mortgage, a fresh wave of panic washed over her. She was a retired high school guidance counselor. She had spent decades building a retirement plan designed to protect her. She had brown-bagged her lunches, clipped coupons, and driven sensible cars for years so she could put money into her pre-tax retirement accounts. Now, she was watching that careful planning bleed out. Pulling that much extra money out of her traditional retirement account every month was a financial nightmare. Because it was a pre-tax account, every dollar she withdrew was taxed as ordinary income. Taking out an extra $50,000 a year had pushed her into a significantly higher tax bracket. Worse, she had recently received a letter warning her that the extra income on paper was going to increase her Medicare premiums for the following year. She was paying taxes on money she was not even keeping, all to prevent her son's house from going into foreclosure. Her cell phone buzzed loudly on the wooden table, startling her. She set down her pencil, put on her reading glasses, and tapped the screen. It was a group text message from Jessica. A digital invitation popped up, complete with animated champagne glasses clinking together over a background of expensive-looking patio lights. Barbara read the message slowly. "Hey everyone! Mark and I are so incredibly excited to invite you to our first annual summer soiree next Saturday evening. We finally finished the backyard patio renovation, and we absolutely cannot wait to pop some bubbly and show it off to our favorite people. There will be catered barbecue, craft cocktails, and amazing company. Dress code is resort casual. We cannot wait to see you there." Barbara felt her stomach drop completely into her shoes. She read the message a second time, her eyes locking onto the words, "backyard patio renovation." Just a year ago, right before the financial collapse, Mark had bragged to her about that patio. He had sat on her floral couch, looked her dead in the eye, and swore he had paid for the stamped concrete, the gas fire pit, and the built-in outdoor kitchen in cash. He had claimed he used a massive year-end bonus from work. He had promised her they were not taking on any new debt for the house. It was a lie. Of course, it was a lie. There never was a bonus. Mark had been drowning in credit card payments back then, terrified of losing his grip on the lifestyle his wife demanded. And they were still pouring money they did not have into a backyard entertainment center. The sheer, blinding audacity of it made Barbara lightheaded. He had financed a built-in pizza oven while his adjustable-rate mortgage went unpaid. Barbara pushed away from the table and walked into her bedroom. She opened the sliding doors of her closet and just stared at her clothes. Her wardrobe was perfectly sensible. It was filled with comfortable slacks, practical cardigans, and modest blouses. She reached in and pulled out a navy blue dress she had found on the clearance rack at a local department store 3 years ago. It had cost her $29. It was a perfectly nice dress. It was clean and appropriate for a summer evening. But as she held it up, a deep, heavy sense of humiliation washed over her. She pictured the party perfectly in her mind. Jessica would undoubtedly be wearing a brand new designer sundress that cost more than Barbara's monthly grocery budget. Jessica's friends from the gated community would be dripping in expensive jewelry, holding premium cocktails, laughing and complimenting the imported stone on the outdoor kitchen. And there Barbara would be, the quiet, frugal older woman in the clearance dress, standing on the very patio her retirement savings was secretly keeping out of the hands of the bank. It was sickening. The absolute injustice of it burned hot in her chest. She was giving up her peace of mind, her sense of security, and her independence, just so Jessica could play pretend for the neighbors. She was fronting the bill for a luxury lifestyle while she ate cheap turkey sandwiches and worried about her Medicare premiums. Barbara threw the navy dress onto the bed and sat down heavily on the mattress. She dropped her head into her hands. Her first and strongest instinct was to reply to the text message with a polite lie. She could say she had a terrible summer cold. She could say she pulled a muscle in her back gardening and needed to rest on a heating pad. It would be so incredibly easy to just stay in her quiet, air-conditioned condo, watch a movie, and avoid the overwhelming anxiety of walking into that cavernous McMansion. She did not want to see the new patio. She did not want to see Jessica gloat. But as she sat there in the quiet room, The anger finally began to burn hotter than the anxiety. Mark had been actively avoiding her calls for a month. Every time she tried to get him on the phone to talk about an exit strategy, to ask him if he had looked for a second job, or talk to a real estate agent about downsizing, he sent her straight to voicemail. He was acting like a frightened child playing hide and seek. He thought if he just ignored the phone, the problem would magically disappear. If she did not go to this party, he would get away with it for another month. He would continue to bury his head in the sand, while her savings account drained faster and faster. She simply could not let that happen. She was running out of time, and she was running out of money. She needed to look her son in the eyes and force him to face reality. She was going to go to that party. She was going to corner him away from the catered food and the clinking glasses, and she was going to demand a solid, concrete plan. Barbara stood up, her jaw set tight with a brand new determination. She walked back out to the living room and over to her small wooden desk in the corner. She pulled open the bottom filing drawer and took out a thick green folder labeled with the name of her bank. She sat down at the desk and carefully pulled out the last 6 months of her bank statements. She laid them out flat on the wooden surface. There it was, printed in stark black and white. Row after row of massive transfers. $4,200, month after month, wired directly from her account to his mortgage lender. She did not just look at them. She opened her pencil cup, pulled out a bright yellow highlighter, and uncapped it. With precise, deliberate strokes, Barbara highlighted every single mortgage payment. She highlighted the massive tax penalty warnings. She highlighted the dwindling total balance of her life savings. She wanted Mark to see the bright yellow lines of his failure. She wanted him to see exactly what his cowardice was costing his mother. These papers were the undeniable, physical proof of her sacrifice. They were the hard, cold facts of the situation, entirely stripped of any emotional manipulation. She reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a plain, brown manila envelope. She gathered the highlighted bank statements, tapped them on the desk to even the edges perfectly, and slid them into the envelope. She sealed it with a piece of clear tape, pressing her thumb down hard to make sure it was secure. She walked over to the entryway where her sensible canvas handbag was hanging on a hook. She unzipped the main compartment and dropped the manila envelope inside. It fit perfectly next to her reading glasses and her wallet. Barbara looked at her reflection in the small hallway mirror. She looked incredibly tired. The stress of the last 6 months had etched deep, permanent lines around her eyes, and her shoulders carried a heavy, invisible weight. But as she looked down at the canvas bag holding the absolute financial truth of her son's entire existence, she felt a sudden, electric surge of power. She was not going to be a victim to their vanity anymore. She was going to go to the summer soiree. She was going to wear her clearance rack dress with absolute dignity. She was going to eat their catered barbecue. And then, when the moment was exactly right, she was going to pull Mark aside and hand him that envelope. She was going to tell him that he had exactly 30 days to list the house on the market, or the Bank of Mom was officially closing its doors forever. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing down her gray hair. It was finally time to put an end to the gilded cage. It was time to bite the bullet, face the music, and get her life back. The Saturday evening air was thick and heavy as Barbara turned her 2015 Honda onto the freshly paved streets of Oak Creek Estates. The entrance was flanked by massive stone pillars and a guardhouse that always made her feel like she was trying to sneak into a foreign country. She rolled down her window slightly, giving her name to the security guard, and proceeded down the wide, winding roads. Every house in this subdivision looked like a fortress. They were enormous brick and stone structures with perfectly manicured lawns that looked too green to be real. As she approached Mark and Jessica's house, her stomach tied itself into a familiar, painful knot. The driveway was entirely packed. The street was lined with vehicles that looked like they belonged in a luxury car dealership showroom. There were sleek silver electric cars, massive black sport utility vehicles, and shiny German sports cars. Barbara found a spot near a fire hydrant at the very end of the block. She parked her modest, slightly dusty Honda, making sure she was not blocking anyone's perfect driveway. She turned off the engine and sat in the quiet car for a long moment. She reached over to the passenger seat and rested her hand on her canvas purse. She could feel the stiff outline of the manila envelope inside. It was her anchor. She took a deep breath, grabbed the purse, and stepped out into the humid Ohio evening. Walking up the long, stamped concrete driveway, she could hear the party before she could see it. Soft, acoustic music was playing from perfectly hidden outdoor speakers. There was the distinct hum of expensive blender motors and the high-pitched, practiced laughter of a dozen different conversations. Before Barbara even reached the doorbell, the massive double doors swung open. Jessica stood there, holding a tall glass of sparkling wine, looking like she had just stepped off a magazine cover. She wore a flowing, pale yellow linen that probably cost more than Barbara made in a month of substitute teaching. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in loose, beachy waves. "Barb! Oh my gosh, you made it!" Jessica announced loudly, projecting her voice as if she were speaking to a small crowd rather than just her mother-in-law. She leaned in for an air kiss, careful not to let her makeup actually touch Barbara's cheek. "Hello, Jessica." "The house looks lovely," Barbara said politely, gripping her purse tightly with both hands. Jessica took a step back and looked Barbara up and down. Her eyes stopped at Barbara's feet. Barbara was wearing a pair of comfortable, supportive navy blue walking shoes that matched her clearance rack dress. They were practical for the woman her age who spent a lot of time on her feet. "Oh, look at those," Jessica cooed, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, condescending tone. "Those are just the most cute, sensible little shoes. So practical. I keep telling Mark, we need to take you to the department store to get you something with a little more flair. But you just love your comfort, do you not?" Barbara felt a hot flush creep up her neck. The insult was perfectly disguised as a compliment, a tactic Jessica had mastered over the years. "They get me where I need to go, Jessica. Thank you." Jessica looped her arm through Barbara's and basically dragged her into the cavernous foyer. The house was alive with activity. Men in crisp polo shirts and expensive watches stood in small circles, holding craft beers and talking loudly about golf handicaps and stock portfolios. Women in designer summer wear congregated around the massive marble kitchen island. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the back of the house, Barbara could see the main event. The newly renovated patio was massive. There was a huge stone fire pit surrounded by plush outdoor sofas, a built-in grill station that looked like a commercial kitchen, and elegant string lights draped perfectly overhead. Waitstaff in black uniforms were walking through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with bacon-wrapped scallops and tiny, complicated appetizers. It was a catered affair. Mark was paying a catering company to serve hors d'oeuvres, while his mother was paying the bank to keep a roof over his head. The absolute insanity of it made Barbara want to scream. "Come on, Barb! I want to introduce you to some of the girls," Jessica said, pulling her toward a group of women standing by the sliding glass doors. Barbara scanned the room desperately for Mark, but he was nowhere to be seen. He was probably hiding in the garage or the basement, avoiding her entirely. "Ladies!" Jessica interrupted a conversation about a private preschool. "This is Mark's mother, Barbara. Barb, this is Lauren and Tiffany." The two women turned and offered polite, overly bright smiles. Lauren held a martini glass, and Tiffany was adjusting a heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. It is so nice to meet you, Lauren said, her eyes quickly doing the exact same up and down assessment Jessica had done moments earlier. Barb is just the sweetest, Jessica gushed, patting Barbara's shoulder like she was a well-behaved golden retriever. She lives in this adorable little 55-plus community over on the east side. She was a high school counselor for absolutely forever. Bless her heart, she is still substitute teaching just to stay busy. Can you even imagine wanting to work at that age? I just tell her she needs to relax and let us spoil her, but she is so incredibly stubborn. Barbara bit her tongue so hard she thought she might taste blood. Jessica was painting her as a charity case. A sweet, slightly pathetic old lady who needed her wealthy children to look after her. It was a complete and utter fabrication. The only reason Barbara was working in a high school classroom again was because Jessica's husband had drained every last cent of his own money and had started draining hers. Barbara forced a tight smile. I enjoy the students. It keeps my mind sharp. Well, that is just precious, Tiffany chimed in, taking a sip of her drink. My mother is in a retirement village down in Florida. We had to move her there after my father passed. It is so hard when they get older and just do not have the resources to keep up a real house. The conversation shifted seamlessly away from Barbara, as if she were a piece of furniture they had finished admiring. Jessica and her friends began discussing a new investment property Lauren and her husband were supposedly purchasing down in the Carolinas. Barbara stood there, trapped in the circle, her hand resting heavily on her purse. She felt entirely invisible, a ghost haunting a party she was secretly funding. A few minutes later, Jessica turned her back slightly to Barbara, leaning in closer to Lauren. She did not lower her voice nearly enough. In fact, Barbara was absolutely certain Jessica wanted her to hear every single word. Honestly, Jessica sighed dramatically, swirling the wine in her glass. It is just such a shame the older generation did not know how to invest properly. They just put their money in basic savings accounts and hoped for the best. Mark and I try to help Barb out, but she is just stuck in that depressing little condo. It is so small, Lauren. You would not even believe it. It smells like old books and peppermint candy. I feel terrible for her. But what can you do? They just did not plan for the future the way we do. The words hit Barbara like a physical slap across the face. Depressing little condo. Did not plan for the future? She looked at Jessica, watching the younger woman laugh lightly at her own cruel joke. Jessica was wearing thousands of dollars worth of clothes and jewelry, standing in a multi-million-dollar home, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was broke. She was a paper millionaire, built entirely on debt and deceit. Meanwhile, Barbara had planned perfectly. She had built a solid, impenetrable fortress of security. Her condo did not smell depressing. It smelled like peace. It smelled like freedom from exactly this kind of superficial, exhausting rat race. A sudden, sharp wave of protective anger washed over Barbara. She was not angry just for herself anymore. She was angry for the 35 years she had worked. She was angry for the early mornings, the late nights, and the careful budgeting she had done to ensure she would never be a burden. She was angry that she had sacrificed her peace to protect the fragile ego of the woman currently mocking her to a group of strangers. Barbara gripped the leather strap of her purse with white knuckles. She could feel the manila envelope inside, heavy with the truth, the bank statements, the highlighted rows of $4,200 transfers, the absolute proof that the woman standing here bragging about her investment savvy was actually living off the charity of a retired high school guidance counselor. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger settle into a cold, hard resolve. She was not going to make a scene in the foyer. She was not going to give Jessica the satisfaction of playing the victim. She was going to wait. The caterers were starting to usher people out toward the patio for the main dinner service. Barbara turned away from the circle of laughing women. She walked outside, feeling the humid air wrap around her. She found a quiet corner near the outdoor kitchen and stood perfectly still. She watched the guests mingle. She watched the expensive food being served. She finally spotted Mark, standing nervously near the fire pit, laughing entirely too loudly at a joke one of his neighbors made. He looked terrified. He looked like a man standing on a trap door, waiting for the lever to be pulled. Barbara reached into her purse and let her fingertips rest against the top edge of the manila envelope. The party was in full swing, but for Barbara, the real event had not even started yet. She would let them eat their catered food. She would let Jessica give her grand tour of the new patio. She would wait for the absolute perfect moment to burn this entire illusion to the ground. The soft chime of a small silver bell cut through the heavy summer air. A man wearing a crisp white shirt and a black apron was walking through the crowd, politely announcing that dinner was ready to be served. The caterers had transformed the new stamped concrete patio into what looked like a high-end outdoor restaurant. Barbara followed the herd of guests toward a massive, rustic wooden dining table that sat right in the center of the patio space. It was the kind of table you see in expensive lifestyle magazines, easily large enough to seat 20 people comfortably. Down the exact center of the wood ran a perfectly straight line of fresh imported orchids and thick, glowing pillar candles. The place settings featured heavy silver cutlery, heavy crystal wine glasses, and cloth napkins folded into intricate shapes. It was a staggering display of wealth, or at least the illusion of wealth. Barbara found her seat near the far end of the table. She carefully placed her canvas purse in her lap, letting her hands rest on top of it. She could feel the rectangular shape of the manila envelope pressing gently against her legs. She looked down the length of the table and spotted Mark. He had strategically placed himself at the complete opposite end, sitting near the built-in outdoor kitchen. He was holding a glass of dark red wine, his knuckles completely white. He was sweating right through his expensive designer polo shirt, and he refused to look in his mother's direction. He was acting like a frightened animal backed into a corner, hoping that if he stayed perfectly still, the predator would just walk right past him. Jessica, of course, took the seat directly in the middle of the long table, positioning herself perfectly as the absolute center of attention. The waitstaff began moving seamlessly around the guests, pouring expensive Pinot Noir into the large crystal glasses and setting down plates of food. The main course was a beautiful, thick cut of catered salmon, resting on a bed of roasted asparagus and wild rice. It smelled absolutely incredible, but Barbara found that she had absolutely zero appetite. Every single bite of food on this table, every drop of wine, and every imported flower in those centerpieces was being financed by the money she was secretly draining from her retirement account. As the dinner progressed, Jessica completely held court. She dominated the conversation with the practiced ease of a woman who loved nothing more than hearing her own voice. "We just feel so incredibly blessed this year," Jessica announced loudly, projecting her voice over the soft background music. She took a sip of her wine and smiled at a man sitting across from her. "Mark has just been killing it at the firm. They practically hand him a new major account every single week. And with the market doing what it is doing, our portfolio has just been so much fun to watch." Barbara took a tiny sip of her ice water. She looked down at her plate. The lies were flowing as freely as the alcohol. Mark was not killing it at the firm. He had been passed over for the very promotion they had banked their entire financial future on. Their portfolio was not fun to watch. It was entirely non-existent. The only thing they were aggressively accumulating was high-interest credit card debt and a massive, unpaid adjustable-rate mortgage. "We are actually thinking about joining that new country club they are building over in Westlake," Jessica continued, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was staring at his plate like a man walking to his own execution. The initiation fees are a little steep, but you really cannot put a price on surrounding yourself with the right kind of people. You have to spend money to make money, right? A few of the men at the table nodded in agreement, murmuring their approval. Barbara felt a dull, throbbing headache starting to form right behind her eyes. She sat there in complete silence, chewing a small piece of salmon, listening to her daughter build a magnificent castle out of thin air. It was a masterclass in suburban delusion. Everyone at the table was playing the exact same game, nodding and smiling, trying to figure out who had the biggest house, the newest car, and the most impressive vacation plans. As the sun finally set and the warm glow of the overhead string lights illuminated the patio, the caterers came around to clear the empty plates and pour more wine. Emboldened by 3 full glasses of Pinot Noir, Jessica became even louder and significantly more unfiltered. The conversation inevitably shifted, as it always does with people in their 30s and 40s, to the burden of aging parents. Lauren, the woman who had inspected Barbara's shoes earlier, sighed heavily and leaned forward on her elbows. Honestly, we are just dealing with so much right now. My husband's parents just had to move into an assisted living facility down in Florida. The cost is absolutely astronomical. It is nearly $8,000 a month for a shared room. It is completely draining their savings, and we are probably going to have to step in and help them out soon. A collective groan of sympathy went around the table. Everyone had a story about the staggering cost of healthcare and the terrifying reality of getting older in America. Jessica seized the moment perfectly. She set her wine glass down on the wooden table with a soft thud and sighed dramatically, pressing her hand against her chest. Right? It is just wild how much it costs, Jessica said, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. You really have to plan. You have to be smart with your money when you are young, so you do not become a burden on your kids. She paused, letting the silence hang for just a second. Then she turned her head and looked directly down the length of the table, locking eyes with Barbara. A slow, condescending smile spread across Jessica's face. The microaggressions of the evening were officially over. Jessica was ready to perform for her audience, using Barbara as the perfect cautionary tale. Honestly, Jessica laughed, a sharp, ringing sound that cut through the warm night air. Mark and I are doing so well. We will probably just build a little shed out back for Barb when her Social Security dries up. You know, since she did not plan for the long haul. We will have to take care of her. The words hung in the humid air like thick, toxic smoke. Build a little shed out back for Barb, since she did not plan for the long haul. For a terrifying 5 seconds, nobody said a single word. The table was absolutely silent. The background music suddenly felt entirely too loud. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their expensive dining chairs. Lauren took a very sudden, nervous sip of her water. The guy sitting next to Barbara suddenly found his cloth napkin incredibly fascinating. Then, exactly as Jessica had wanted, a few of the guests let out low, awkward chuckles. They did not want to ruin the vibe of the party. They were guests in this magnificent house, drinking this expensive wine, so they played along. They chuckled at the expense of the quiet, frugal older woman sitting at the end of the table in her clearance rack dress. Barbara did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not gasp in horror. She turned her head very slowly and looked entirely past Jessica. She looked straight down the center of the table, past the expensive orchids and the glowing candles, right directly at her son. Mark was frozen. He had heard every single word his wife had just said. He heard the table laugh at his mother. He knew, better than anyone on this entire planet, that his mother had planned perfectly. He knew that she had sacrificed her own peace and her own security to save his entire life. This was his moment. This was the exact second where a decent man, a grateful son, would stand up, throw his napkin on the table, and defend his mother. This was the moment he should have told his wife to shut her mouth and show some respect. But Mark did not do any of those things. Mark stared a hole straight into his empty porcelain plate. He completely refused to meet his mother's eyes. His shoulders were slumped, his jaw was clenched tight, and he remained absolutely, devastatingly silent. He was too cowardly to face his wife, too terrified of losing his fake plastic life to do the right thing. He threw the woman who had given him everything straight under the bus to save his own skin. Sitting there in the warm summer night, a profound and complete shift happened inside Barbara's chest. The motherly instinct to protect her son at all costs simply died. The unconditional, foolish grace she had been extending to him for the last 6 months evaporated completely. She realized in that exact moment that she was not helping him by paying his mortgage. She was enabling a monster, and she was letting a coward hide behind her skirt. She was burning her own house down to keep 2 deeply ungrateful people warm, and all they were doing was complaining about the smoke. Barbara placed her hands flat on top of her canvas purse. The manila envelope was waiting inside, thick with bank statements and highlighted truth. She felt her heartbeat slow down to a calm, steady rhythm. She was no longer anxious. She was no longer humiliated. She was entirely, beautifully free. The awkward chuckles faded away, and the conversation slowly started to pick back up as the guests desperately tried to move past the uncomfortable moment. Jessica looked incredibly pleased with herself, taking another victorious sip of her Pinot Noir. She thought she had won. She thought she had established her absolute dominance and put her poor, pathetic mother-in-law right back in her place. Barbara gently cleared her throat. It was not a loud noise, but it carried a strange, commanding weight that made the 2 people sitting closest to her stop talking immediately. She picked up her cloth napkin and calmly wiped the corners of her mouth. The dinner of disrespect was officially over. It was time for dessert. The warm, humid Ohio evening suddenly felt entirely, completely still. The soft, acoustic guitar music playing from the hidden outdoor speakers seemed to fade away into nothing. The awkward chuckles from the dinner guests had died down, replaced by the clinking of heavy silver forks against porcelain plates. Barbara sat at the end of the massive rustic wooden table, her hands resting quietly in her lap. For the last 6 months, a suffocating, heavy blanket of anxiety had draped itself over her shoulders. She had lived in constant, quiet terror. She had worried about her dwindling retirement account, her rising tax bracket, and the very real possibility that she might outlive her own hard-earned savings. She had let that fear control her, all in the name of protecting her son. But as she looked down the length of the table at Mark, who was still staring rigidly at his half-eaten catered salmon, something inside Barbara simply snapped. It was not a loud, violent break. It was a quiet, profound realization. She was not a savior. She was a victim of her own misplaced guilt. She looked at her son, the boy she had raised to be honest and hardworking. He was 35 years old, sitting in a multi-million-dollar house he did not own, drinking expensive wine he could not afford, while his retired mother footed the bill. He had just sat there, completely silent, while his wife publicly humiliated his mother and joked about putting her in a shed. He had chosen the illusion of his wealth over the reality of his mother's sacrifice. In that exact moment, the unconditional grace Barbara had been extending to him completely evaporated. The fear was gone. The anxiety was gone. She realized with absolute clarity that she was setting herself on fire just to keep a deeply ungrateful woman and a deeply cowardly man warm. She was sacrificing the security she had built over 40 years of working in a public high school for a daughter-in-law who genuinely despised her. Barbara felt her heart rate slow down to a calm, steady rhythm. The dull headache that had been lingering behind her eyes all evening just vanished. She felt a sudden, incredible rush of liberation. She was done playing the victim. She was done funding this pathetic charade. She calmly picked up her heavy cloth napkin from her lap and gently wiped the corners of her mouth. She placed the napkin neatly next to her plate. Jessica was holding court again, having successfully moved past her cruel joke. She was leaning across the table, gesturing wildly with her wine glass, talking to Lauren about a brand new interior designer she wanted to hire for the upstairs guest bedrooms. Barbara reached down and unzipped her sensible canvas purse. She slipped her hand inside and felt the smooth paper of the plain brown manila envelope. It was thick, with 6 months of bank statements. It was heavy with the absolute, undeniable truth. She pulled the envelope out and placed it flat on the wooden table in front of her. She took a slow, deep breath, smoothing her hand over the top of the paper. Then, without saying a single word, she placed her fingertips on the edge of the envelope and gave it a firm, deliberate push. The envelope slid down the exact center of the table. It glided smoothly over the polished wood. It passed the expensive imported orchid centerpieces. It slid right past the plates of roasted asparagus and wild rice. It bypassed the glowing pillar candles. The sudden movement caught the eye of the man sitting next to Barbara. He stopped talking mid-sentence and watched the brown package travel down the table. The envelope came to a dead stop right exactly next to the base of Jessica's heavy crystal wine glass. Jessica stopped her story about the interior designer. She blinked, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in confusion. She looked down at the plain, unglamorous envelope sitting next to her expensive drink. And then she looked all the way down the long table at Barbara. Barbara smiled. It was not a mean, vindictive smile. It was the warm, relaxed, genuine smile of a woman who had just reclaimed her entire life. "Speaking of planning for the long haul, Jess," Barbara said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a steady, commanding weight that cut through the background music and the quiet dinner chatter perfectly. "I need a quick favor from you." The entire table fell completely silent. Nobody moved. Lauren and Tiffany stared at the envelope. The men holding their craft beers froze in place. Every single eye was glued to the quiet older woman in the clearance rack dress sitting at the end of the table. Barbara leaned forward just slightly, resting her forearms on the table. She looked directly into Jessica's confused eyes. "The bank keeps mailing the paid-in-full mortgage receipts to my condo instead of here," Barbara said, her voice smooth and entirely conversational. "Since I have been paying the $4,200 monthly mortgage on this house directly out of my retirement account for the last 6 months, I would really appreciate it if you could update the mailing address. My accountant is getting a terrible headache trying to keep all the tax penalties straight." For 5 agonizing seconds, the silence on that patio was absolutely deafening. It was a total, complete vacuum of sound. You could hear the faint crackle of the gas fire pit burning in the background. You could hear the wind rustling the leaves of the expensive oak trees in the backyard. But not a single human being took a breath. Jessica's face completely transformed. The smug, confident glow vanished in a fraction of a second. All the color drained out of her cheeks, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Her mouth fell open slightly, but no words came out. She stared at Barbara as if the older woman had just spoken to her in a dead language. "What?" Jessica finally whispered, her voice barely a scratch in her throat. She looked frantically across the table at Mark. Mark, what is she talking about? Is this a joke? Mark did not answer. He did not say a single word. He closed his eyes tight, rested both of his elbows heavily on the dining table, and buried his entire face in his hands. He let out a long, shaky, pathetic breath that sounded like a tire losing air. His reaction was all the confirmation Jessica needed. Jessica's hands started to visibly shake. She reached out and snatched the manila envelope off the table. She tore at the flap, her expensive acrylic nails ripping the paper. She pulled out the thick stack of bank statements. Barbara had made sure they were impossible to misunderstand. Jessica flipped to the first page. Right there, in stark black and white, was the logo of Barbara's bank. And right below it, highlighted in bright, glowing yellow marker, was a transfer for $4,200. Next to it, the text clearly read, "Wire transfer to Oak Creek Mortgage Lending." Jessica flipped to the next page. Another highlighted yellow line, $4,200. She flipped again. May, June, July, 6 consecutive months of the exact same payment, drawn directly from a traditional retirement account belonging to Barbara. The papers began to shake uncontrollably in Jessica's hands. The reality of the situation crashed down on her all at once. The brand new Lexus SUV parked in the driveway, the catered salmon sitting on her plate, the expensive spa weekend she just bragged about to her friends. It was all a complete lie. She was not a wealthy suburban housewife. She was entirely broke, and the sweet, modest woman she had just mocked in front of her neighbors was the only reason she was not currently sleeping on the street. The absolute humiliation radiating from Jessica was palpable. She dropped the bank statement onto her dinner plate. They landed right in the remaining juices of the salmon. The guests around the table looked like they wanted the ground to open up and swallow them whole. Lauren stared down at her lap, her face bright red, suddenly incredibly interested in the fabric of her cloth napkin. Tiffany took a massive gulp of her wine, keeping her eyes glued to the centerpieces. The men who had been bragging about their stock portfolios just minutes earlier suddenly looked terrified to even breathe. The beautiful, carefully constructed illusion of the McMansion had been completely shattered, and the jagged pieces were lying all over the expensive wooden dining table. Barbara sat back in her chair. She felt lighter than she had in half a year. She did not feel sorry for Jessica, and she certainly did not feel sorry for Mark. She had delivered the truth, plain and simple, without yelling, without crying, and without stooping to their level of petty insults. She picked up her glass of ice water, took a slow, refreshing sip, and set it back down. The lion's den had been entirely declawed, and Barbara was finally ready to go home. The dinner party dissolved faster than a sugar cube in a cup of hot tea. It was a textbook example of the awkward Midwestern goodbye, only sped up by 1,000%. Lauren and Tiffany practically sprinted for the stamped concrete driveway, not even bothering to offer a polite excuse to their hosts. The men muttered weak apologies about babysitters and early morning tea times, actively avoiding eye contact with everyone. Within 5 miserable minutes, the massive luxury patio was entirely deserted. It was left with nothing but half-eaten plates of catered salmon, glowing pillar candles, and a profound, suffocating silence. Inside the cavernous foyer of the house, that silence did not last very long. As Barbara walked quietly through the massive living room to retrieve her sensible canvas purse and her light evening sweater, the screaming finally began. Jessica's voice echoed terribly off the imported marble floors. She was completely unhinged. She called Mark a liar, a fraud, and an absolute failure. She demanded to know how he could possibly humiliate her in front of her country club friends. Mark finally found his voice, but it was incredibly weak and entirely defensive. He tried to calm her down, but his panic just threw more gasoline onto the fire. Barbara did not stop to listen to the argument. She did not feel the maternal need to intervene or mediate the fight. She had spent the last 6 months carrying the massive, crushing weight of their marriage on her own shoulders, and she was officially setting that burden down forever. She walked out the front doors, leaving them wide open to the humid summer night. The evening air hit her face, and it felt incredibly refreshing. She walked down the long, paved driveway, past the brand-new luxury-leased sport utility vehicle that had caused so much resentment, and climbed into her older Honda. When she turned the key, the engine hummed reliably. She put the car in drive and pulled away from Oak Creek Estates. As the massive stone entrance pillars faded in her rearview mirror, the tight knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for half a year completely vanished. She felt lighter than air. Exactly 1 week later, the doorbell at Barbara's condo rang. It was a rainy, dreary Tuesday morning. Barbara was sitting at her small oak dining table, drinking her store-bought drip coffee, enjoying the absolute peaceful quiet of her 55-plus community. She walked to the door and opened it to find Mark standing on the small concrete porch. He looked entirely defeated. The expensive designer polo shirts and luxury watches were gone. He was wearing a faded college sweatshirt and a pair of old, worn jeans. The dark bags under his eyes were heavy. He looked like a man who had finally stopped running from a monster and just let the collapse happen. Barbara stepped aside and led him into the hallway. She went straight to the kitchen and poured him a hot mug of coffee, setting it down on the table exactly like she had done 6 months ago when this entire nightmare first started. Mark wrapped both of his hands tightly around the warm ceramic mug. He looked across the table at his mother, and for the first time in a very long time, his eyes were completely honest. The fake suburban smile was entirely gone. He told her that the house of cards had officially fallen to pieces. Jessica had packed 2 massive suitcases the morning after the dinner party and went to stay with her sister downtown. She was furious, embarrassed, and actively talking about hiring a divorce lawyer. Mark had spent his entire week meeting with a real estate agent and a financial bankruptcy counselor. They were listing the multi-million-dollar house on the market that coming Friday. They had to sell it quickly, even at a slight loss, just to avoid formal foreclosure proceedings. The luxury cars were being returned to the dealership, and every single credit card was completely frozen. Mark told her he was moving into a cheap 1-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of town. He apologized to her. He cried genuine tears of regret. He told Barbara he was so incredibly sorry for using her retirement funds, for hiding from her phone calls, and for being a coward. He apologized for letting his wife disrespect her at that dinner table while he stared at his plate. He admitted he had been absolutely terrified of losing a lifestyle he could not even afford to maintain. Barbara listened quietly, taking slow sips of her coffee. Her heart broke for her son, because watching your child hurt is the hardest thing in the world. But her resolve was entirely rock solid. The retired guidance counselor inside of her knew that rescuing him again would only cripple him forever. She reached across the small oak table and placed her hand firmly over his. She told him she loved him very much. She told him that she forgave him for the dinner party and that she knew he was in a tremendous amount of pain. But then, Barbara laid down the absolute hardest boundary of her entire life. She told Mark that the Bank of Mom was permanently closed. She was officially cutting off the financial pipeline. She took the time to explain the harsh, unforgiving reality of retirement finance in the United States. She told him about the severe tax penalties she had swallowed by pulling money out of her traditional retirement accounts early. She explained how the extra paper income was triggering massive Medicare premium hikes for her next year. She told him about the terrifying, very real fear of outliving her money. She looked her son dead in the eyes and explained that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with sprawling houses, fancy cars, or what the neighborhood friends think of you. True wealth is peace of mind. True wealth is knowing you can pay for your own medical care, your own groceries, and your own roof without ever having to become a financial burden to your children. She had sacrificed a massive portion of that peace to save him, and she was stopping right now so she could start rebuilding her nest egg. She needed to ensure her own long-term security. She told him it was time for him to finally learn how to live on cash, how to stick to a strict budget, and how to face the real adult world without a safety net catching his fall. Mark nodded slowly. He did not argue with her. He did not beg for one more loan or one more month of mortgage payments. The harsh wake-up call had finally worked. He squeezed his mother's hand, finished the last of his coffee, and walked out the door to start tearing down his fake life and building a real one. 4 long months passed. The hot Ohio summer finally faded into a crisp, beautiful autumn. Barbara sat on her small concrete patio at the back of her condo. The leaves on the massive oak trees in the community were turning brilliant shades of orange and red. She had a warm mug of apple cider in one hand and her digital tablet in the other. She was looking at a popular travel website. She smiled warmly, tapping the screen to confirm a final reservation. It was a ticket for a 10-day cruise to Alaska for the following summer. She was finally going to see the glaciers with her friends. Things were not entirely perfect. She had lost a significant chunk of her savings to Mark's mortgage and the subsequent tax penalties. She would have to keep picking up substitute teaching shifts at the high school for at least another year to repair the damage. But as she sat there in the quiet morning air, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride and relief. Mark had successfully sold the house. He was living well within his means in his small apartment, paying off his consumer debts slowly but surely. He and Jessica were actually in marriage counseling, trying to see if their relationship could survive the reality of a normal middle-class budget without the luxury facade. Mark called Barbara every single Sunday afternoon now, and he never hid the truth from her again. Barbara had bought back her dignity. She had given her son the toughest, most necessary lesson of his adult life, and she had entirely reclaimed her own future. She took a slow sip of her warm cider, feeling completely at peace. She finally knew that the greatest luxury in the entire world was simply being able to sleep soundly at night. Thank you so much for joining me today on Eva's Whisper. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to set a tough financial boundary with your own family, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support helps us share more real, relatable stories every single week. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.